the UN Charter, signed by Russia, the Soviet Union. The 1975 Helsinki Agreement, signed by the Soviet Union. The 1990 Charter of Paris for a New Europe, signed by the Soviet Union. The 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, signed by the Russian government, the post-Soviet Russia. All of those documents signed by either the Soviet regime or the Russian regime, which is the legally recognized international inheritor, right, successor of the Soviet state. All of those agreements are still in force, and all of them say that countries are sovereign and can freely choose their foreign policy and what alliances they want to join. Let's even go farther than that. I mean, you don't have to go farther than that, but let's go farther than that, Lex. Is an autocratic, repressive regime that invades its neighbors in the name of its own security something new in Russian history? Did we not see this before? Does this not predate NATO expansion? Does this not predate the existence of NATO? Would Oliver Stone sit here in this chair and say to you, you know, they had to impose serfdom in the 17th century because NATO expanded? They had no choice. Their hands were tied. They were compelled to treat their own population like slaves because, you know, NATO expanded. I mean, I could go on through the examples of Russian history that predate the existence, let alone the expansion of NATO, where you have behavior, policies, actions very similar to what we see now from the Kremlin. And you can't explain those by NATO expansion, can you? And so that argument doesn't wash for me because I have a pattern here that predates NATO expansion. I have international agreements, founding documents signed by the Kremlin over many, many decades, acknowledging the freedom of countries to choose their alliances. I'm not suggesting, Lex, that everything the West has done has been honorable or intelligent. Fortunately, we live in a democracy. We live in liberal regimes. We live under rule of law. Liberal in the classical sense of rule of law, not liberal in the leftist sense. We live in places like that, and we can criticize ourselves. And we can criticize the mistakes that we made or the policy choices or the inactions that were taken. And there are a whole lot of things to answer for. And you can now discuss the ones that are your favorites, the dishonor or the mistakes. And I could discuss mine. And we could spend the whole rest of our meeting today discussing the West's mistakes and problems.
And we won't end up in prison for it.
Yeah, Alex. And so I'm thankful for that.
Yes.
And I'm thankful that people may disagree and that people make the argument that NATO expansion is to blame. But you see, I'm countering two arguments here. I'm countering one argument, which is very deeply popular, pervasive, about how Russia has this cultural tendency to aggression. And it can't help but invade its neighbors, and it does it again and again. And it's eternal Russian imperialism, and you have to watch out for it. This very popular argument in the Baltic states. It's really popular in Warsaw. It's really popular with the liberal interventionists, and it's very, very popular with those who were part of the Iraq War squad that got us into that mess. So I'm against that. And the reason I'm against it is because it's not true. It's empirically false. There is no cultural trait, inherent tendency for Russia to be aggressive. It's a strategic choice that they make.
Every time it's a choice made, it's not some kind of momentum. Every time it's a choice that we should judge for the choice that it is, for the decision.
And therefore they could make different choices. They could say, we don't have to stand up to the West. We don't have the capabilities to do that. We can still be a great country. We can still be a civilization unto itself. We can still be Russia. We can still worship in Orthodox cathedrals, or we can still be ourselves, but we don't have to pursue this chimerical pursuit, this elusive quest to stand up to the West and be in the first ranks of powers. So I'm countering that argument. I'm saying it's perpetual geopolitics. It's a geopolitical choice rising out of this dilemma of the mismatch between aspirations and capabilities. It's not eternal Russian imperialism. And I'm also countering the other argument here, Lex, which is to say that it's the West's fault. It's Western imperialism. Very popular on the left, very popular with realist scholars, very popular with some of the people recently on your podcast. And so it's neither eternal Russian imperialism, nor is it Western imperialism, right? The mere fact that the West is stronger than Russia is not a crime on the part of the West. It's not a crime that countries voluntarily want to join the West, that beg to get in, either the EU or NATO or other bilateral alliances or other trade agreements. Those are voluntarily entered into, and that's not criminal. If the West's sphere of influence, which is open, an open sphere of influence, which, as I say, people voluntarily join, if that expands, that's not a crime, nor is that a threat to Russia ipso facto. Right? NATO is a defensive alliance, and the countries are largely pacifists who are members of NATO. And NATO doesn't attack. It defends members if they are attacked. And so the idea that Ukraine, which had the legal right, might want to join NATO and the EU, which was not going to happen in our lifetimes and was not a direct threat to the Putin regime, since the Western countries that make up the EU and NATO decided that Ukraine was not ready for membership. There was no consensus. It was not going to happen, but it's Ukraine's free choice to express that desire. And if your government is elected by your people, freely elected, meaning you can unelect that government in the next election, and that government makes foreign policy choices on the basis of its perceived interests, that's not a crime, Lex. That's not a provocation. That's not something that compels the leader of another country to invade you, right? That is legal under international law, and it's also a realist fact of life. The realists like to tell you, that Russia here was disrespected, Russia's interests were not taken into account, et cetera, et cetera. But the real world works in such a way that treaties matter, that international law matters. That's why people like me were not in favor of the U.S. 2003 invasion of Iraq, Lex, because it wasn't legal, in addition to the fact that we thought it might backfire. But, Lex, like I said, there are a lot of things about the West that we ought to criticize as citizens, and we do criticize. But we have to be clear about where responsibility lies in these events that we're talking about today.